I'm Ryan Cantor. In this video, we're talking about the Palmetto Series between Clemson and South Carolina baseball. To help us do that, we have Chris Clegg. Chris Clegg is a writer for Pitcher List. He has a Substack called Dynasty Dugout. He's also on the Toolshed, a fantasy baseball podcast. Chris is a South Carolina native, but unfortunately a South Carolina Gamecock fan as well. Thanks for joining, Chris.
Yeah, Ryan, thanks for having me. It's always good. We've known each other for quite a while, so it's good to finally just do a recording together. So looking forward
Yeah,
to that. Even though it's a rivalry show, it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. Both these programs are kind of in a similar spot. Last year, Clemson was 8-0, and South Carolina was 7-1 when the series started. Clemson swept them and reached 14-0, and with the record and the sweep of South Carolina, Clemson fans thought this team was really good, but they hit ACC play. They were below 500 in the ACC. They missed the tournament. They ended up firing Monty Lee because of it. And of course, at South Carolina, things were even worse. Missed the tournament. Mark Kingston is now in his sixth season, and they're only 54-66 in SEC games during his time. So both programs kind of in a rebuilding, retooling kind of situation, although one has a six-year coach. And of course, Clemson with Eric Bakich, brand new coach. Kind of just let's start high level. Where do you think these two programs are?
Well, Clemson obviously is going to take a bit of time, I think, to rebuild it. I like Eric Bakich a lot. I mean, he took Michigan to College World Series final, and Michigan's not a historic baseball program by any means. So I think he's certainly capable. I know he's coached at Clemson before. He comes from a great coaching tree. And Clemson's in a bit of a state of, rebuild, I guess, per se. They've got some younger guys, but there is some talent that I like. I mean, there's one of my favorite arms that was in South Carolina last year, Tristan Smith, didn't get drafted and ended up coming to Clemson. Got Will Taylor, who we'll discuss, who's a multi-sport athlete, but really high-end baseball player, in my opinion. I'm afraid that football may have hurt his baseball career, but we can get into that a bit. But there is younger talent. I think it's going to take a bit of time with any new coach. Some coaches come in and just hit it right off the bat and just kind of get the best out of their guys. But that's not always the case especially when you lose some talent from previous year's teams. And we saw, Clemson lost a big piece last year in Max Wagner, who went to Baltimore, and several others that departed from the team. So it's going to take a bit of time. They had some transfers out. That's natural when you lose a coach. But I do think that Bakich is pretty solid. And honestly, as a Carolina fan, I'm a bit envious. You look at what Mark Kingston's done, and 6 years in, he's still done much of nothing. We took on your old coach that you fired in a different role. We took on 4 transfers from Clemson. So it's a weird spot for the Gamecocks. But I do think that this could be a much improved year for South Carolina, especially if we have health with the pitchers. That was really the biggest thing last year. Talent on the mound just couldn't stay healthy, and really lack of depth just hurt them. And this year they took in a ton of transfers in the offseason, some from Clemson, you got one from Notre Dame, kind of all over the board. They kind of took on guys, and so far so good. It's early on. I think we'll talk about some of the competition that both teams have faced, but I like what I've seen so far. If the pitching staff can stay healthy, I think it could be a really strong year for the Gamecocks. It's a make or break year for Kingston. I think that if he struggles, SEC plays tough. They play a lot of tough teams in conference, and if they don't make the tournament, he's got to be fired. There's no right to retain him at this point. So it'll be interesting to track this weekend. I think will be telling for both teams. So it'll be fun to see.
Yeah, obviously this is a huge series, but baseball is a bit different than you could look at basketball. Clemson lost to South Carolina, and South Carolina was awful, and Clemson was at least decent, and still, as of this recording, kind of in the mix for a tournament. When South Carolina made the Final Four that year, they lost to Clemson. So these early series don't necessarily indicate too much about what the direction of the team's going to go that year, but there's still a lot on the line in terms of what the season means, how you view it as a success, and so on. Let's pull up their two teams' lineups here. So these are more or less the general lineups they tend to use and the associated stats. A couple things here, and we'll start with the South Carolina Gamecocks. You'll notice that none of the Clemson transfers are listed. Any before we dive into these guys, any commentary on the Clemson transfers? You had Jonathan French, the catcher, and a couple others. Are they making an impact yet?
It was an interesting move for a lot of them, I'd say, especially with French, because South Carolina does have quite a bit of depth at the catcher position. So it was an interesting move for him. He's basically only pinch hit, but he's been good in the spots that he's pinch hit. I mean, 7 at bats, but 3 hits. He's had a double in there too. So he's come in clutch in those spots, and really, that's been the only one of the major contributors. And I even say major, like that's just 7 at bats so far in 6 games is not ideal, but just a pinch hit guy. So not a lot of contribution from the Clemson transfers. That could change, but right now it seems like they've kind of set on this lineup so far, like you have, and we've seen pretty much this be the starting lineup pretty much every day, and with the exception of we've seen a couple of weekday games where they've started a couple other guys, but other than that, like this is the squad they're going to roll out this weekend against Clemson, unless something drastic changes midweek.
So one thing that really stood out to me when I was pulling these tables together was the big discrepancy in home runs. Clemson fans, I think, are fairly pleased to see Clemson move away from the kind of the station to station, the 3 true outcomes kind of MLB approach, which I think is good, right? You should move away from that because putting the ball in play in college against college defenses can work, and pushing the envelope and stealing bases and letting catchers, middle infielders make mistakes, I think is a good thing. But Clemson has 6 home runs on the season. You look at South Carolina; they've got players with 4 and 5 home runs all up and down their order. Is that just a small sample size thing, or has South Carolina got some great power hitting?
They've definitely got the power hitting. They lead the nation in home runs so far with 26. Wake Forest is just behind at 25. Wake Forest also has an additional game in there. So, looking at the home runs per game, again, South Carolina's at the top. They're just smacking the ball, averaging 3.25 home runs per game is pretty substantial. And as you mentioned, the lineup just kind of up and down has these big power guys. Several guys, not so much, but like, especially you look at like Gavin Casas, his brother, you may recognize the name if you're a baseball fan, Tristan Casas with the Red Sox, their first baseman. So Gavin was a transfer in this year, much like his brother, very big guy, big power stroke from that left side. And he's listed at 6'4". So he's got he's coming in with the most power, big exit velocities, what you like to see. But also you look, Braylon Wimmer's got a big power stroke as well. He's up to 4 home runs. He's got the power and the speed going on there. Cole Messina, he's been a bit of a surprise with the power, but we often see, some players take a bit longer to translate in the college game. And that's what he's really done this year, is taking that step forward. And Will McGillis, he's another one that's really stepped up his game this year. Is it a small sample size? Possibly, but I do think several of these guys do have legit power. I think Gavin Casas could be at the top of home run boards at the end of the season when we look at the overall college game. Braylon Wimmer, another power bat, as I mentioned, and Ethan Petrie, all guys that I do think can sustain this kind of power stroke long term. So, yeah, the lineup's built around power, but I do like that they sprinkle in some of the other guys too that are, the gap power. And Talmadge Lecroy's one that's really stepped up his game a bit. We'll say a special shout out to him because, he went to my church. So that's kind of neat to see. I'm proud of what he's done. Really just taking his game to another level this year. And they talked a lot about it, how he'd worked hard this offseason. And the early results are showing a lot of good gap power, a lot of singles, but you need to have that. You've got to mix that in when you have a lineup of boom or bust with the power like they've got. So when you've got these guys in the lineup that can do that, it certainly helps balance it out.
Yeah, so South Carolina swept UMass Lowell. They swept Penn. So not exactly elite competition, but these numbers are dominant, as they should be. Of course, Clemson swept them last year, and a lot of the same players are back, at least on the Clemson side. So it's baseball. It's impossible to predict, but I'm going to ask you to give me a little bit of a prediction. What are you generally expecting in this series?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I do think the Penn series is a bit more telling. I'm not sure people realize that Penn's actually a pretty solid baseball team. Went 33-15 last year. They took 2 of 3 from A&M last year that was a semifinals of the College World Series. And that's not to kind of talk up the competition, but at the same time, like UMass Lowell, whatever. I mean, they dropped 20-17-12 on them. And then coming in, like I thought that Penn would give them a better idea of where they were, and they gave them some tough games. It wasn't blowouts like we had seen before, and Penn made them, put pressure on with the bats, and it was really down the wire on Sunday, especially. And I was kind of worried that South Carolina was going to lose that game, but the pitching results have been good early on for South Carolina, and that's definitely going to be something to watch. You've got Will Sanders that's going to throw Friday. Sanders is a potential first-round pick, and one that I think could give Clemson some struggles. Sanders at his best is a first-round talent, and so far we've seen that in his 2 starts. He's been really good. But Noah Hall on Saturday is another guy who's just been pretty dominant too. And Noah Hall was an App State transfer last year and had a pretty underrated season. Smaller guy, doesn't get a ton of love, but he's been absolutely filthy so far this year and came off throwing 8 innings against Penn, scoreless with 10 Ks. So really good outing. He has 16 Ks over 13 innings on the season. And then Sunday, you can kind of go with a mix of guys. Most likely going to go with a Jack Mahoney, which he didn't have the best outing on Sunday against Penn, but he's been the Sunday guy so far. I'm not sure they'll throw Eli Jersenbeck in there, who's a true freshman, but I think Jersenbeck's really talented. He's probably the midweek guy for the foreseeable future, but probably get Mahoney on Sunday. If Sanders and Hall pitch up to standard on Friday, Saturday, they should be really good ball games. And if South Carolina's bats are on early on, then it gives them the best chance to win. I think Sunday's where it gets interesting because you don't know what you're going to get at Jack Mahoney. We've seen a mixed bag so far. I mean, he was not good against Penn. UMass Lowell didn't tell us much, but if you get a good outing from him, you might have a good ball game. But I think Clemson's best chance is probably on Sunday. And if they sneak, like you said, it's baseball. Anything can happen. So if you sneak one Friday or Saturday, then it gives you a chance to win the series on Sunday. You've got to feel pretty good if it's 1-1 and you're going into Sunday having that advantage. So the problem is South Carolina's boomer bust power bats. They go dead one game. You got to rely on the pitching.
Yeah, and that's what's so frustrating about kind of that 3 true outcome kind of baseball is you can dominate and then it's tough to get that one run in that clutch situation. So that'll make it interesting. Clemson's pitching against UCF in this last weekend series was pretty poor. Ryan Amons, who was the closer last year, is the Friday night starter. And he's been pretty good, but that just kind of speaks to the lack of pitching in that rotation that they have. That they had to make that move. So they swept them last year, but I think it's going to be a little tougher this year. So Chris, thank you for joining, folks. If you enjoyed listening to Chris on this topic, be sure to subscribe to his Substack. You can just Google his name in Substack. Check him out at his Twitter as well, which you can see his handle there below his name. Also, if you could, please subscribe to this channel. It helps us eventually be able to monetize it. Be sure to like and comment as that helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for listening.